right, so what did day one really mean?
The Dan York State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Takeo Comfort Solutions.
Greetings. Great to have you in on this Thursday evening. We have to talk about what happened at Washington yesterday. Dominates the news cycle, and again tomorrow morning kicks up again with Maria Yovanovitch, the former Ukrainian ambassador, who will add to this story of how Rudy Giuliani probably branded her the wrong way for President Trump and caused her demise and a whole bunch of other things in the midst of this saga. So Joe Cammarano from Providence College is here to work it out with me as we continue to try to figure out what's happening in Washington. In the meantime, this headline real quick. At press time, we tape our programs in the early afternoon, you may know, and this was just breaking. The thing I take away from this, amidst what is the normal reaction of horror to a student using a gun, and against his fellow students, a school shooting, as we so casually refer to it, is the media's reaction to this stuff. Real-time news gathering is not easy, and it is urgent, and it is competitive, and it is often irresponsible. I watched two cable networks battle each other, and I'm guessing the third was in the middle of it too. I won't name them because it could happen to any one of them at any time. But one had the shooter deceased by a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The other had no information on that. Then they came up and said, oh, he's injured. And then the other network went back and said, oops, others are reporting that he may be alive. Oops, and it went back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And I just wish that in our business, for your benefit, that we would just not report it until everyone's got consensus that it is true, even media. Sometimes we ought to lay down our competitive instincts to just be able to be right. Just a thought. Alrighty, to the headline from yesterday, one of so many. Here's our network package from last night, then later we'll tell you about what they're saying this morning.
Do you swear or
The top U.S. diplomat in Ukraine, Bill Taylor, revealed a new detail in his testimony. He says a member of his staff, David Holmes, overheard a phone call between President Trump and EU Ambassador Gordon Sondland. Taylor told lawmakers the president asked the ambassador about the investigations.
Following the call with President Trump, the member of my staff asked Ambassador Sondland what President Trump thought about Ukraine. Ambassador Sondland responded that President Trump cares more about the investigations of Biden.
President Trump on Wednesday denied having that conversation with Sondland and dismissed the testimony as hearsay.
All third-hand information, nothing direct at all. It can't be direct because I never said it.
A line reiterated by Republicans on the Intelligence Committee.
You didn't listen on President Trump's call and President Zelensky's call?
I did not.
You've never talked with Chief of Staff Mulvaney?
I never did.
You never met the president?
That's correct.
This is what I can't believe, and you're their star witness.
The first public hearing of the impeachment inquiry follows more than 100 hours of testimony behind closed doors from more than a dozen witnesses. But a number of administration officials have refused to appear, ordered by the White House not to comply.
I'd be glad to have the person who started it all come in and testify. President Trump is welcome to take a seat right there.
While House Democrats say Wednesday's hearing helped build their case that the administration withheld U.S. military aid to try and pressure Ukraine to open up politically motivated investigations, Republicans argue the aid was released and there was no quid pro quo.
All right, day one's in the books, Professor. Your take was?
Well, the testimony, the statements, made me queasy. Listening to exactly what Ambassador Taylor particularly said was really, as an American, really nauseating.
That he said it, or that, or are you talking about what was
the content of what he shared?
Meaning the stories he told.
The stories that he told, I think, should, putting aside any ideology or partisanship, we should really feel awful right now. All of us. This is unbelievable.
And much of what he said, he talked about, was laying out you know, we have this big dispute between facts and opinions now, right? The Democrats have brought nothing but opinions, according to Republicans, and da 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 da. We need the facts, and it's a combination of event description rather than facts. It's events described and analysis about what those my chair is falling, by the way, literally on the television. So I'm not.
Makes me feel taller.
Yeah. So what they were saying was, but true, right? As I try to pull up here, it was a layout, and Republicans are suggesting that these two guys are opinion offerers. Well, they did a whole lot more than that.
Well, they weren't opinion offerers. They were communicators of information
And analysts
that they received. They were analysts. And look, you know, remember, Taylor particularly is a lifelong Republican. He served under Republican administrations. And this is not a guy who actually cherishes the idea of going before Congress and saying these things. He was clearly in pain. It was clearly difficult for him. This is probably about as honest as we're going to get in Washington. And so
Deep state.
Yeah, otherwise known as sort of the permanent Washington community that makes sure that things don't blow up and that the country is protected and safe and our interests are served abroad. Yeah, deep state, the people who actually do the work that make us what we are. I'll call it deep state. That's fine. You know, it's a ridiculous. It's offensive. And
Our respect for institutions is dwindling, and this Republican Party is doing everything it can to maintain its survivability with Donald Trump and tearing institutions down in the process.
I do think there's an obligation of Republicans to make sure that the president isn't railroaded, and it's an obligation of Republicans to make sure that the Democrats don't go overboard, because Democrats go overboard too. But the absolute facts are on the side of those who said this was a deal that said if you don't go after the Bidens publicly, you're not getting money to protect yourselves, to protect the lives of your own citizens. That's morally repugnant, and all Republicans should admit that.
It's all hearsay.
And then make their decision. It's not hearsay.
It's all
You
hearsay.
know it's true.
They didn't hear from the president directly. It's hearsay.
Read
Move
the
on.
transcript. You know, people who say
I read the transcript. It's a perfect call.
Yeah,
what does it matter?
tell me what's in the transcript.
You can't read?
Tell me exactly what's in the transcript. I'd be willing to bet a lot of people who say read the transcript trying to defend the president haven't actually understood what was in the transcripts. And understood that transcripts were edited.
Coming back from the role play here, what's interesting is all this background and environment discussion that happened yesterday is important to understand the transcript.
Of course it is. Look, you know, I don't know what happened to Rudolph Giuliani, but maybe it's the money that he got after September 11th, you know, sort of farming himself out as a security consultant. But his behavior, I would argue, is borderline treason. Borderline. I didn't say it's treason, but it's treasonous.
Are you feeding the Trump overuse of important terms beast here?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I think, you know, I think I have a track record on this show as being relatively moderate when it comes to sort of academic analysts of the president. I remember Corey Brettschneider and I were together, and he was far more extreme in his view.
From Brown University?
Yeah, and it turns out...
Constitutional scholar.
That's right. And it turns out Corey was more correct than I am, that this is a very dangerous situation that seeks to undermine, or might inadvertently undermine, our entire post-World War II strategic interest in the world. That's how serious this stuff is. And Ukraine is the key country because there's nothing between Ukraine and Europe and NATO. And so this is really serious stuff. And to be going around doing all this informal policy is ridiculously stupid and highly inappropriate. And Taylor and Kent are unimpeachable by anybody who has a conscience.
All right. When we come back, we'll talk about developments today, the House Speaker speaks, and more. Stay with us. And then there are today's discussions about yesterday's events.
Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi says the testimony from Wednesday's hearing amounted to a description of bribery on President Trump's part.
The bribe is to grant or withhold military assistance in return for a public statement of a fake investigation.
Bill Taylor, the top diplomat in Ukraine, delivered a surprise revelation during the first public hearing in the impeachment inquiry.
The member of my staff could hear President Trump on the phone asking Ambassador Sondland about the investigations.
Taylor says the staffer overheard a conversation between the president and ambassador to the EU, Gordon Sondland. Taylor said Sondland told the staffer the president cared more about investigating the Bidens than Ukraine.
What this call indicates, as other testimony has likewise indicated, is that the instructions are coming from the president on down.
President Trump says he doesn't recall the conversation.
I know nothing about that. First time I've heard it. The one thing I've seen that Sondland said was that he did speak to me for a brief moment, and I said no quid pro quo under any circumstances.
The staffer who overheard the conversation is scheduled to give a closed-door deposition Friday, but Republicans say they really want to hear from the whistleblower who triggered the impeachment inquiry.
I will not allow a trial in the Senate to go forward with my vote unless the whistleblower comes forward.
I will defend the rights of the whistleblower vehemently. Vehemently.
The next person to take a seat for public testimony is former ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch, who was recalled from her post after President Trump's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, orchestrated a smear campaign.
I got to tell you, there's a lot in that package right there. There is a lot. First of all, let's take it piece by piece. So the president, he doesn't recall his conversation with Sondland. This was new info from Bill Taylor saying it was a little bit of a weird thing that his assistant just, recently recalled that there was the moment this past year where Sondland received a phone call, or was on a phone call, don't know who made it to whom, but at a restaurant, which is kind of an unsecure environment anyway.
In Kiev.
In Kiev, yeah, talking about this situation. The president doesn't recall, but knows that if he spoke to him, he asserted no quid pro quo. I would lay my mortgage that the president never said that to Sondland in that particular phone call, because that would have been something that Sondland would have reacted out to his fellow luncheoners. Nobody seems to be able to look at this stuff and go, that doesn't hunt, that dog doesn't hunt, that dog doesn't hunt, that dog doesn't hunt. Come on.
I guess the first thing I say is I have stopped even bothering listening to the president's response to questions like this.
Think about
because
what
he's
you're
so
saying
dishonest.
there.
He's so dishonest that we might as well just take what he's saying as what he's doing to protect himself, because that's all he does. And this is not somebody whose word can be trusted as having any resemblance to reality. It's all about his interest. It's all about his position. He lies. We have a president who tells more lies than truths. I'm not saying everything he says is a lie, but he tells more lies than truth. So let's stop bothering listening to him.
Yeah, well, the very idea, by the way, that there's a growing consensus that he lies more than he tells truths and that we should stop listening to him, in my humble judgment, ought to be impeachable in and of itself. The idea that the trust factor with the American public is so damaged. Politicians, I can hear my radio lines for the sycophants who dial the show. Oh, everybody lies, everybody lies, everybody lies. What's the difference? Obama lied. Just this denial thing is becoming one of the most incredible psychological exercises I've ever seen in a time period, mass behavior in a time period. It's incredible.
It's unique, yeah. I can't think of a time in recent history. Because if you go back to Clinton, Democrats never said Bill Clinton.
They admitted that he was lying.
Tell you the truth.
They just said sex.
He's a slime ball. He's lying. It's about sex. It's not about his conduct in office. Yeah, we don't like him. And my favorite line is, if I had a 12-year-old daughter, I wouldn't let him within 10 miles of her. But the reality is,
they acquiesced in behavior and measured it against.
I don't care about the lying. I care about the behavior. And the behavior.
That in of itself is a compelling statement.
Again, Taylor and Kent yesterday, these are unimpeachable guys. These are people who don't want the limelight. These are people who are reluctant to be there. And they're getting up and they're saying, no, this is what really happened. And we were told that this is the policy. He ain't getting anything until he publicly tells us he's going after the Bidens and the 2016 election, whatever that is.
All right, so you've got in that package, you got the president, denying and then adding an assertive quid pro quo must have happened during that phone call. Nancy Pelosi now is moving to the bribery/extortion mode here, upping the ante. The problem is that most of America is still not hearing or seeing, say, Bill Taylor's 40-minute presentation before he even took Q&A.
Right. But again, these are the opening two. Your segment had Jim Jordan calling them star witnesses. Star witnesses are often not the first ones on the stage. I was in play in high school, and I was on stage first, but I was only a supporting actor.
Oh yeah, what was your character?
I was Benny South Street in Guys and Dolls.
Oh, you were.
Yeah. But anyway, so Taylor and Kent are two good lead-offs. They're not the stars. Yovanovitch is clearly there. Sondland is there. If we ever get anyone in the administration to come and actually testify before Congress, they're obviously afraid to do that. Those are going to be the stars. So I think we have to, it's a rolling thing. And, the Watergate hearings, it wasn't the first person who basically said, oh yeah, there's this secret taping system in the White House. And we have all the conversations. What? So we don't know exactly what's coming.
Lindsey Graham, you heard him there. He says, I'm going to vote no on receiving the trial unless the whistleblower is in play. It is amazing to me what they'll hang their hats on here, and the idea that we're going to destroy whistleblower protection for both politics and corporate culture in this country on this case is, I can't even compute it.
Well, I have two things to say about that. One, if the whistleblower were to come forward, Lindsey Graham would find another reason not to vote to remove. So that's a red herring. Lindsey Graham's never going to change his vote. But number two, I want to defend him a little bit. If only the whistleblower's report was sufficient, was the evidence presented to impeach and try to remove, I would probably be on his side. But the reality is the whistleblower summarized what we're now hearing from the people who are involved. And so we're actually hearing the details of what the whistleblower reported. So the whistleblower is now irrelevant. He's saying, look, there are lots of people who can testify to this, and guess what? That's what they're doing. So the whistleblower is irrelevant. He's sort of a side player now.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I thought the Democratic congressman's response to the guy who started this, saying, well, we'll bring in President Trump for a cross. It's point made, right? Point made. The whistleblower didn't start
somebody who has some kind of relationship to him in the White House, and the White House is blocking all.
You know what's interesting about the whistleblower? If you pay attention to the facts of this case, as they've been in the chronology has been laid out, the whistleblower got Ukraine paid.
That's exactly right.
I don't think people are focusing on that. The whistleblower got Ukraine paid. That the whistleblower started to speak about this matter, got to the White House, and the thing got paid 2 days after the whistleblower appeared to be an issue.
And that's actually an important point, because I teach about this in my public administration class. It's called guerrilla government. People who see something wrong and they try to right it, and often through whistleblower protection. They're seeking an outcome that they think is the appropriate outcome, the right outcome, legally right as well as policy right. So you're correct on that. That's a really important point.
Yovanovitch tomorrow, she's going to lay the lumber on Giuliani, I'm sure.
I'm going to wait and see, but yeah, I expect that she's another career civil service employee, foreign service, and she's got integrity, way beyond anybody in the White House. So.
And the guy who replaced her, Taylor, is incredibly empathetic about how she was treated. Never mind Kent, who watched the whole thing go down.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
She, too, has not met and talked with the president. And the Republicans will say, yet another product of hearsay.
Part of the problem is Republicans think winning and losing is the game, rather than the policy and the implications and U.S. interests. And that's the state of politics as the Republicans play it, and Democrats often play too. It's not about winning or beating the other side. It's about good public policy, promoting the interests of the American people, and they're losing sight of that because they're engaging in groupthink with the president. They're just protecting the president. It's like a family where somebody is accused of doing something wrong, and they go, oh, no, it can't be someone
I
in my
wonder
family.
if there is a moment, though, when they all look at each other and go, you thinking what I'm thinking? Yeah. And it all goes like this. Bang.
When I was in D.C. recently, that's the rumor that I heard, that 30, 40 senators are like, you know, I wish we weren't defending this guy, even though we're still doing it.
All right, we come back. The former governor of Massachusetts is now in the race. Stay with us. All right, Bloomberg is meddling, and Deval Patrick, as we speak, is in New Hampshire taking out his papers. What say you about the two new entries into the race?
You know, you got a couple $1 billion to throw around. You might as well throw it around.
Patrick has that kind of dough?
No, Patrick's. I think Patrick just did the math. He figures, you know, if a Democrat wins next year, I'm going to be in my 70s the next shot I have, because they're going to try to run for re-election, and by that time I'll be an old man, and so this is the only time I have. And my wife now is better, and I really wanted to do this in the first place. It's the ego. It's the mirror test. You look in the mirror and you go, oh yeah, I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and darn it, I can be president.
Huh, that's the senator from Minnesota's character. Look where he is, crying out loud. But, formidable road to victory? Because I don't know how the ego is served by getting smashed in a late entry in a race.
Well, I think what he sees is there's such fragmentation, and he sees in 2016 that's how Donald Trump got the nomination. He figured there is a path for him to go through, and that is nobody is sort of coalescing around one person, and so he can drive in and compete with them at the same level and maybe even beat them, because people aren't rallying around one.
Well, his proximity, I was doing some research on this, and no modern day president has been elected without winning one of Iowa or New Hampshire, one of them. So he's going to park himself in New Hampshire. He is a neighbor. He's not unknown, and so he's formidable there.
He is, but I mean, there are some
so is
really,
Bernie and Elizabeth. I mean, they are neighbors as well.
Yeah, and there are really good people with deep roots in New Hampshire who have taken other sides.
Bloomberg and his money, can he buy into this race?
He can buy into this race, but again, I think that's the problem. I think the problem in this country is billionaires think they can do everything, and I think Mike Bloomberg falls prey to that. I don't think this is a wise move for him. But he's got $60 billion. Losing a couple billion is fine.
We can only dream, Joe.
I'll take 1% of that.
Thank you for your thoughts. Final word when we come back. Coming up on the Friday program, I should have mentioned this at the top of the show and I forgot to. Bob Walsh from the National Education Association was scheduled for tonight. He'll be on for tomorrow night's show. I know that because I'm going to tape it now. And so we'll talk to you tomorrow about the lawsuit that the cities and towns have against the state. It's all about union contracts and how long they last. See ya. Have a great night. See you on the radio at 3, 2. Bye.